Welcome to a splice of life science marketing, your go-to show for life science marketing professionals in biotech, medtech, and diagnostics. Join us for sharp, strategic conversations that turn cutting-edge insights into real-world marketing advantage. I'm Matt Wilkinson.
And I'm Jasmine Gray. In each episode, we'll cut through the hype and complexity with practical plays you can use to earn trust, stand out in crowded categories, and convert attention into momentum.
And here we are again, Matt. How are you?
I'm good. Good to see you again.
You as well. I am so excited for this podcast because I think this is my all-time favorite of your blogs. All right, so 15 buyer interviews. They're transcribed, they're coded, they're built into real personas. The campaigns go to market, and then the open rates, they plummet. They're 7%. Your normal is 35%. You're left wondering, what the heck just happened? The research wasn't the problem. The buyer left the room somewhere between the first draft and the final approval. What a visual that was. Legal softened the headline. The product team added 2 features. The VP asked for the heritage reference. Each decision individually defensible. Together, they produced a consensus document, not a customer document, in what I used to call the Frankenstein model. Today, I'm debating with you on the organizational gravity problem in life sciences marketing content and on whether persona AI is the right structural fix. You argue that keeping a synthetic buyer present throughout the process changes the evidence dynamic in review meetings. I think the problem is real and the direction is right, and I'm going to push on where the solution has its limits. Ready?
I'm looking forward to it. Heads up, there definitely are some limits out there, but I think there are far more benefits to this approach than most people realize.
All right, let's see where we land. So the story blames organizational gravity for why good research doesn't survive to market. But the Allison person lost those arguments because she was arguing from instinct against process. Legal had a process, the VP had a process, and she had gut. It is the lesson that life science marketers need better evidence in review meetings, or they need better internal political skills to protect the insight they already have?
So I think it's a great question, but I don't think it's just about political skill and evidence. They're not necessarily alternatives. They're sequential. You can't win a campaign review through political skill alone. Very often these processes go into a black box. They go into a system, they run through, and you're not part of them. And even if they are, going and pushing back becomes a fight. And as you said, every single change on its own was defensible, but in the end, you've created a Frankenstein that no longer speaks to the customer, even though the whole point of the piece is to speak to the customer. What I'm arguing for is a way of keeping your buyer in that loop and being able to create evidence at every stage as to why a decision is good or not. And if a change needs to be made, they do need to be made. How can we do that in a way that doesn't lose the customer as part of that change, but rather is something that keeps them in that loop? So I think it's really important. And a lot of the work that you and I have been doing has been about building these synthetic customers and trying to turn them into a way that captures everything about context of the company and the products in a way that allows us to then to speak to the customer in the words that they use in answering their problems and keeping them and actually enabling them to be a tool that not only marketing can use and generate data to push back on, but at each stage they can be used by regulatory, by legal, to actually be a bit of a sparring partner. This is a change I need to make. How can I do so in a way that doesn't lose the customer?
So the political reality in most life science organizations is that senior stakeholders' instinct about brand outweighs marketing's evidence about buyer language more often than the framework implies. Persona AI makes Allison's position more defensible, It's not making her position more powerful. I'm not arguing against evidence. I'm arguing that the framework may be overselling how much evidence changes the review meeting outcome versus how much it implies making the lost argument more documented.
I think it's an interesting point, but I don't think it's about winning the arguments. I think it's about shifting the narrative and shifting the tools that are used. So it's not just about saying we need to include X, Y, and Z, and then for the marketer themselves to be pushing back. These are tools that we can give to each of the people in that process. And if we want to be customer centric, why not keep our synthetic customer part of that process at every stage? So as they're going through that review, making sure that any changes that they are actually suggesting don't destroy the very core of what you're trying to achieve. And that's the argument that I'm really trying to make here. It's about going from gut instinct and sort of trying to step into your customer's shoes versus the rest of the process not really even knowing much about the customer's shoes or the process that you're trying to go through, but really trying to make sure that that synthetic customer is there throughout the entire process.
So it strikes me that a lot of organizations almost pay lip service to saying they're customer centric. And synthetic customers actually are a way to honestly be customer centric. So I want to pull on that thread a little bit more. You say grounded synthetic personas surface 3 to 5 objections that generic LLMs miss entirely. But a persona AI trained on historical interview data can't know about a competitor's recent clinical publication or a procurement freeze driven by an economic downturn or a new regulatory guidance that changes the buyer's risk tolerance. Does persona AI give you accurate objections or confident objections that were accurate, I don't know, months ago?
The answer is both. And let's start by looking at what a persona AI is. It's a form of synthetic customer, and there's a lot of academic research that looks at asking the large language model to take on the persona of a specific type of person. These work pretty well, and you can use the data in the large language model itself to be an approximation of your customer. The argument that I've been making and that it has shown up in the work that we've been doing so far is that by feeding the large language model a set of context about voice of customer, about what's being said online, brand sentiment, about you and your competitors, they're building up a really detailed picture of a narrow customer persona, allows us to have a much better picture of who we're actually selling to. Now, that gives us a really good idea of the type of customer. Is it perfect? Is it going to be able to know what's going on? Absolutely not. And I think it's a case of really asking the question, how far can we push this? But I would argue that having this synthetic customer as part of your process is a huge leap forward than having a beautiful PDF that's been designed and been delivered and is maybe looked at by marketing, but more often than not is stuck on a hard drive rusting away and never ever used. So I'm arguing that by building these synthetic customers, we can change the way that we think about customer centricity, and we can actually bring the customer with us through the entire commercial process.
So the leap can go too far, meaning marketers who are relying on persona AI to validate their copy may be less likely to go back to real buyers for context, not more likely, because the synthetic customer is providing a form of validation that lulls you into complacency and confidence. The risk isn't that persona AI gives wrong answers. The risk is that it reduces the urgency of asking real buyers questions. The more confident the synthetic customer feedback, the more it functions as a substitute for buyer conversations rather than a supplement to them. The refresh cadence you describe is the right answer, but refresh cadence requires discipline that tends to erode under campaign deadlines. And the operational reality is that the 18-month-old persona will still be running when the market has moved because the campaign deadline didn't leave time for a refresh cycle.
So I think there's a few things to clear up here. The operational risk is absolutely real. And it's not just that the answers may be wrong. The large language models are so convincing that those wrong answers will be delivered convincingly. So that's something we have to be very, very aware of. And that means that we do need to make sure we're building governance around how we use these. I would also challenge that the process of building these completely shifts the narrative around how we build persona. Yes, I absolutely agree that we still need to get sales and marketing alignment. We really need to still have that part of the process. But I don't think that we need to be spending the same time sat in workshops, getting people to talk and fill out one-line answers to a series of questions that more or less they're picking up off of a single LinkedIn profile. What this does is it allows us to build a really, really deep, rich data set about each of our customers or each of our customer personas. And once we've done that, the AI's tools allow us to interrogate that as if they're real humans and they're synthetic versions, essentially digital twins. And that then allows us to have a much richer experience. As things change, we can easily update the context documents, add to them, bring in extra information. And we've discussed recently how using AI to perform thematic analysis to be able to do that. These tools allow us to update things much, much quicker than we ever could before. And the way that agents work these days, we're even able to automate some of these changes. We're at the early stages of seeing how these synthetic customers can be used to approximate our customers, but I'm convinced that this is the way forward.
So you've also said that sales teams use the same synthetic customer to pressure test pitches and prepare for discovery calls. Sales and marketing have different relationships with buyer objections. Marketing wants to understand the buyer's world. Sales wants to handle the buyer's objections. Doesn't a shared synthetic customer paper over a tension that actually needs to be surfaced?
It surfaces the tension rather than resolving it. Marketing's Persona AI identifies that the buyer's primary concern is workflow confidence, and the sales team's prepared pitch leads with platform performance. That's a documented misalignment. So the synthetic customer makes it visible in a way that separate buyer research documents rarely do, because both teams are asking the same persona, the same questions. The tension between understand the buyer's world and handle the buyer's objections, I don't think it's really a failure of sales marketing alignment. It's a predictable difference in function that becomes commercially costly when the two versions of the buyer never meet. Shared persona AI creates the meeting point without requiring a cross-functional meeting to discuss it. And if we're doing our job right when building the context for these, we're capturing all of that in the right way. What the product manager does with that visibility is a leadership decision, but the PM who can show a documented gap between the buyer's expressed concerns and the sales pitch language is something concrete to bring to a QBR. That's far more traceable than the abstract claim that sales and marketing are misaligned.
So making misalignment visible is valuable if the organization is structured to act on it. In most life science tools companies, marketing and sales have separate reporting lines, separate planning cycles, and separate incentive structures. The product manager who identifies a sales marketing message gap through Persona AI has a finding that requires organizational collaboration to resolve. If the infrastructure for that collaboration doesn't exist, the finding lives in a presentation and doesn't change anything. The shared synthetic customer creates a shared evidence base. It doesn't create the cross-functional forum in which the evidence can be acted on. If the product manager takes the gap finding to a QBR where the VP of sales and the head of marketing are both present and neither has authority over the other's team messaging, the finding produces acknowledgement rather than action. The framework is right that the shared persona is valuable. It may be overestimating how much visibility alone changes the organizational behavior.
Yeah, Visibility and diagnosis are prerequisites for change, not the mechanism for change. Somebody who brings a documented gap to a QBR, has not solved the organizational structure problem. They've created the evidence that makes the organizational structure problem visible for people who can solve it. That's far more useful than the alternative of knowing it exists but not having any evidence. I think there's also a slightly different challenge as well. We know that AI is fundamentally changing roles and changing the way that organizations need to operate. My argument is as AI starts to transform how organizations operate, we need to be thinking about how can we use AI to to bring the customer into every conversation that we have. This is my suggestion for how we do that. And being able to query a synthetic customer in a meeting about everything from messaging through to sales or even in the sort of the innovation phase, I think that's a really exciting prospect.
Without a doubt, there's a lot of value in that without having to sort of book a meeting with a customer each and every time you have a question. In no way am I saying that a synthetic customer replaces the need for meeting customers face to face, but you don't have to have a meeting for absolutely every question you have. But building a grounded persona AI requires interview transcripts, voice of customer data, LinkedIn profiles of target buyer types, and even more data. Not every life science marketing team has all that data or has it in a form that's usable. At what point is the investment in gathering the input data better spent getting back to actual buyers directly? What's the minimum viable input set that makes the synthetic customer more useful than the real interviews it's built for?
I think that the comparison of real customer interviews versus a synthetic customer build is probably the wrong frame. The minimum viable input to build a persona synthetic customer like this is far lower than actually going through the traditional agency process of building a persona. Yes, we have to have alignment on who our persona are, and that's key. But beyond that, anybody can look up LinkedIn profiles of the sorts of types of people that fill the roles within our ICPs. So that's not difficult. From there, we can go and get voice of customer through deep research if we have to. Even if they're not talking about our specific products, we can at least find out about brand sentiment, about across the category, about the questions that people are asking. These tools exist. We can do that already. If we've got voice of customer, that's fantastic. Let's layer it on. If we've got calls from existing customers, from support or from sales calls, all of that information, if it's logged in a CRM somewhere, and let's hope that they are these days, that data is powerful and we can pull it and we can add it to it. The more data we have, the better. But I would argue that even if you don't have much internal data yet, because it's a new product in a new category, and maybe you haven't got the customers to even go out and buy it, maybe at that very early stage, if you're collating that data in the right way, you can build these synthetic customers as a thin synthetic customer and then add to the context as you build it, as you get it. So I don't think it's a competition between the two. It's more of an additive process. As you get more data, add it to the persona.
The discipline of keeping buyer conversations active is itself extremely valuable, independent of any tool, and extremely important. A team that's doing buyer interviews every 18 months because they have persona AI between cycles may be doing fewer buyer interviews than a team that has no synthetic customer but treats regular buyer contact as a core operating discipline. If persona AI reduces the frequency of real buyer conversations, it may be providing a substitution effect that's commercially worse than the problem it's solving. What's the right cadence of real buyer interviews alongside persona AI to ensure the tool is supplementing buyer contact rather than replacing it?
Yeah, so the supplementation versus substitute risk is important design constraint in the operating model, and it's right to name it explicitly. The correct cadence is that customers should be talked to at the right times, and I would never say that we should supplant those. What I'm really advocating for is building synthetic customers and building these persona AI that are there to be present between every touch point that you would have had already. That way we can keep the customer in the conversation the whole way through the process. And we can use the voice of customer rather than it being some quotes pulled into a pretty PDF or a pretty PowerPoint presentation that we go back to and have to perform mental gymnastics around trying to stand in our buyer's shoes. What we're actually able to do is to have a digital twin of all of that information that we can query between each of those touch points. So I would always advocate for the most customer contact that you can get and for bringing as much of that data that you're allowed to bring back and that they agree to bring back into the organization and putting it into these persona AI. I don't think that changes. One of the things that I'm really passionate about is that between those blocks, however long they may be, that customer data is far more actionable inside a persona AI than it would be if it's just sat in a static PDF or a PowerPoint.
Yeah, there no disagreement there. Having an active synthetic customer that's in many of your marketing campaign meetings always beats the paper in the drawer.
Sure. And I think that's why I'm so passionate about it. As soon as you can see the feedback that you get from rating a particular piece of text based from 3 different persona perspectives, and all of a sudden realize that even if it's not perfect, it's better than what most of us can do on our own, because the mental gymnastics of jumping from one set of shoes to another set of shoes to another set of shoes is so difficult that it just makes life so much easier. We can start using that as a hypothesis. How can we get better? Of course, we're always going to want to finesse the answers. We have to sanity check it. I'm not advocating for taking the human out of the loop at all. But this gives us a perspective that otherwise is really, really hard to keep within the process. And that's what I'm really advocating for.
So I'd advocate that folks who are listening should go to your most recent blog and read the full post, as well as go to our services page that's dedicated to Persona AI to see what a grounded synthetic customer built from real data looks like in practice. So again, thanks. This was a superb blog post, Matt, and I look forward to our next discussion.
So do I. All right. See you soon.
Thank you for listening to a splice of life science marketing. We hope you enjoyed the episode.
If this conversation helped you, the single biggest way you can support the show is to subscribe and leave a review on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. We'd really appreciate it, and it makes a huge difference.
You can find out more about us and the topics we discuss at striven.com or on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for listening. We hope to see you next time.